right, well, welcome. On behalf of the City of Wilsonville, my name is Dan Pauly. I serve as the city's planning manager. I'd like to welcome you to this conversation about housing affordability this evening. We appreciate everyone taking the time and look forward to welcoming everyone. We'll do some introductions later, but at this point, I'll turn it over to Senior Planner Kim Reibold.
Thank you, Dan. As Dan mentioned, my name is Kim Reibold. I am the senior planner here with the city, and I am also the project manager for the Housing Our Future project. This project is a project that looks at our current state of housing and looks at what based on population trends and available land, what we think our housing needs will be between now and the next 20 years in the future. So as part of that work, we are assessing our housing stock, our housing trends, and looking at, how we plan for the future of housing in the city. As part of this work, we will also be looking at strategies to help us make sure that we are meeting those needs as we move forward into the future. And so this is a project that we are just getting started in the past couple of months, and we'll be continuing on throughout 2024 and wrapping up early 2025. But the main focus of tonight's conversation is a conversation on cost burden. And with us this evening are Beth Goodman and Scott Goodman, not related, but consultants with Echo Northwest, who have been assisting us in this housing work. And so I'll give a little bit of a lay of the land of how this meeting will work. Beth will give us a brief presentation on some background about the Housing Our Future project as a whole, but then more specifically on cost burden and specifically how cost burden affects renters in the city. So that will be a little bit of information, and then we will move into a conversation to get your feedback on what you see as barriers to accessing affordable housing, and then provide you with an opportunity to share your ideas of what we should be considering as we move forward with this work. So from a logistical perspective, you probably see a number of boxes and squares on your screen. We have with us tonight some members of the Planning Commission that will be participating and listening to your input. So I do see, I don't know that everybody has been promoted up to the screen yet, but we will be working on that as we move through the presentation. But I thank the Planning Commission for allowing us to use their usual meeting time to have this conversation. And then we do have Councillor Carolyn Berry from our City Council, who is here participating as well. And so we'll have a little more time as we get into the conversation to do some more introductions. We do ask that for people in attendance, it would be really helpful for us if you identify your name. And then as well, if you are representing an entity or organization, if you're here on their behalf, to identify what that organization is. If you are just a resident here to contribute to the conversation, please identify that as well, just by editing your name in the Zoom function. So the first step here is we will have Beth lead us through a presentation on some of these housing items, and then once that is done, we will move into the conversation, and I'll give some instructions for how we'll go about doing that at the conclusion of the presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Beth.
Thank you so much, Kim. I want to provide you with some background information to help provide context to the discussion. I will try not to talk too long. And I think at the end of this, as we're in our discussion, if you have questions about the information I present while we're discussing it, I can certainly answer questions at that point. So I assume everybody can see my PowerPoint? Okay. So walking through this, looking at this project, Housing Our Future in Wilsonville, what we're trying to do is we are trying to identify barriers to accessing housing that is affordable. And of course, affordability varies by income levels. And then look at what is it that the city can do to better support development of new housing that is affordable at different income levels, preserve existing housing that is relatively affordable, and policies to further fair housing, so affirmatively further fair housing, as well as to prevent or reduce displacement as a result of new development. So you don't want to displace your existing lower income residents as you develop and redevelop. Because of course, Wilsonville has some really interesting redevelopment opportunities. So this is really about attainability of housing and making sure that now and in the future, you and your children, other people who want to live in Wilsonville, have that opportunity. So we've got what we've called here the analysis, which is a technical analysis about housing needs, also where we look at buildable land in Wilsonville. It's designed to answer the question, can Wilsonville accommodate expected growth in its existing footprint? And then the strategies, and these are really, what is it that we can do to better meet the community's housing needs? What is it that the city can do in terms of policies or potential programs? So this is really looking at equitable housing opportunities in the future. So the city's already done a lot of work around housing over the last few years. So your town center plan has been developed. It has not been implemented or not implemented fully, of course. Wilsonville did an equitable housing strategic plan in 2020, some of the actions in that have been accomplished. And I think some of the actions in that will probably fall under this project also. Wilsonville made code changes to allow what's called middle housing. And so middle housing is things like duplexes and cottage housing, townhouses, those kind of housing. So Wilsonville has implemented its middle housing code. And you also completed the Frog Pond master plans in 2017 and 2022, which are really Wilsonville's main growth areas and growth opportunities. So this is building on all of that and building on some of the outreach that has been done for those projects. So just thinking about housing, putting housing in some groupings, we've got a grouping called single-family detached housing. About 43% of Wilsonville's housing is that kind of housing. So things like your standard single-family detached house, your manufactured and your mobile homes, cottage housing, those kind of things. Similar to single-family detached to single-family attached, so things like townhomes. You've got some, what I think are frankly nice townhomes in places like Villebois that have been developed, I would say recently developed, maybe it's been 10 years. That accounts for about 10% of your housing. So your smaller scale multifamily housing, so that's things like duplexes, quadplexes, triplexes, that currently accounts for about 5% of your housing. And then multifamily housing, which are buildings with 5 or more structures in it, accounts for about 42% of your existing housing structures. So looking at all of your housing stock, all taken together. Wilsonville has a larger percentage of housing that is in the multifamily with 5 or more units per structure than you see commonly across the Portland metro area. This particular part of the project, this particular meeting today, is really focused on renters and housing attainability for renters. So here we're looking at what kind of housing do renters primarily live in. Well, primarily it's multifamily housing. And in Wilsonville, renters have more access to more housing because you've got a larger share that is multifamily than you see in in many metro communities. That doesn't mean the housing is affordable. And this is a problem across our region. So thinking about affordability, looking since 2014, which is the last time the city did this kind of housing study. So household incomes have increased by about 21%. Over the same period, rent cost increased by 55%. So it used to be that household income and rent increased at about the same pace. But we've been seeing across the Portland metro region, across the West Coast, certainly and nationally, rents increase at a faster rate than household income. So clearly that's unsustainable, and I would say that is definitely a part of our housing crisis that we find ourselves in at this point. Housing sales prices have increased more and faster. So they've increased at 72%, since 2014. So rents and sales prices have gone up faster than incomes. So then we look at a measure of affordability. And so a household is thought to be able to afford their housing costs if they're paying 30% or less of their income on housing costs. So for rental housing, that's things like rent as well as selected utilities like electricity and heating. For ownership housing, that's things like mortgage, interest on the mortgage, insurance, and those same selected utilities. So about 21% of your owner households are cost burdened, so they pay more than 30% of their income on housing costs, but 52% of your renters are cost burdened. So more than half. That more than half of renters being cost burdened is certainly what we're seeing across most of Oregon at this point. I'm not saying it's acceptable. I'm saying that that's the common state of things. But then you look at households that are paying 50% or more of their income on housing costs. They're said to be severely cost burdened. So 27% of your renters, more than a quarter, are paying more than half of their income on housing costs. And then if you look at this by income grouping, and this is for renters, renters who have income of below $50,000, 80% or more are cost burdened. And of course, in the lower income groups, 80% or more are severely cost burdened. So this isn't really surprising because, of course, the lower your income, the less you can afford in terms of rent. So 28% of your renter households have income below $35,000 compared to 13% of your owner households. So there's some market differences here in terms of cost burden and related numbers of households that are cost burden at different income levels. So then as we talk about affordability throughout this project over this next year, we need to acknowledge that affordability really depends on household income. Here we've started with the average household income across the Portland metro region. We haven't talked about households that have income higher than that in this presentation because this is primarily about renter households. So about 12% of your households have income of $114,000 for a family of four, and they can afford about $2,900 a month in rent. About 10% of your households have incomes between $92,000 and $114,000. Those are your middle income households, and they can afford $2,300 to $2,900 in rent. These households can afford most rental housing, probably not quite all, but most rental housing in Wilsonville, but they can't afford home ownership, at least at average costs. So then when you look a little lower down the income scale, households that earn between $57,000 and $92,000, these are your households that can often afford market rate housing, so the existing rents, average rents in the community. At the lower end, they're really scraping by to afford those rents. So, at being able to afford $2,300 a month that household can afford most rents. But when you get down to the households that have the lower income, they can only afford studio units. And since we're talking about households that are four-person households, obviously that's not sufficient housing. And then a third of your households have income below $57,000. A few of these households might be able to afford a studio unit, but most cannot afford market rate rents. And so these are the households that what they can afford is income restricted housing, so government subsidized housing. And as we're talking about and thinking about housing over the next 6 years to 20 years throughout this project, we're thinking about preservation of existing housing, but also building of new housing. And what actions, what things can the city do to support housing development at these different income levels? So what are the housing needs for renters in Wilsonville? We'll just start with, access to an affordable rental unit, full stop. It has to be in the right location, and of course the right location is going to differ for each household. Some households need access to transit, some households need access to school, to get to their jobs, to services, so of course location matters. The housing must meet the size and the characteristic of the needs of the household. So if you've got a four-person household, they're going to have different housing needs than a two-person household, than a six-person household, a multi-generational household, a household with a lot of small children, a lot of older children, obviously no children. These are all going to have different, these households will all have different needs. People need access to housing without discrimination, so that's all around fair housing law. And certainly discrimination in housing rentals, it certainly happens. Our fair housing rules at the national level and then the local level are supposed to address that. Of course, they don't address it enough to erase all discrimination. For households with disabilities, with people with disabilities, it needs to have the necessary accessibility features. So that could be things like ramps. It could be allowing service animals. It could be other things related to a person with disability, like a vision disability or hearing disability. And then, of course, the housing needs to have access to necessary services, especially for people experiencing houselessness or with mental health service needs. So some types of housing have wraparound services. You may hear that term. And so some people need access to those services. And so part of what we're going to ask for in a few moments is help understanding the barriers to accessing affordable rental housing. So we know some of the barriers are there's just not enough rental housing that is different types of housing. So rental housing that is, say, townhouses or cottage housing. Not enough affordable housing in some locations, not enough variety of rental costs, not enough housing with those accessibility features for people with disabilities, not enough housing for very low-income households or households, people who are experiencing houselessness. Of course, housing discrimination is also a barrier to accessing rental housing. You've got a whole set of barriers that are more out of a city's control. Things like credit issues. So your credit rating isn't good enough, or you don't have the necessary documentation or references. Those are harder for a city to fix the problems of, but those are certainly barriers. So we'll ask you in a few moments to talk with us about what other barriers or refinements of any of these barriers. And then our last set of questions that we'll talk about in a few minutes is how can the city help lower or remove the barriers? So these are all examples of policies that we've been talking about a little bit with the public, and certainly we'll be talking about more as we continue this project. So I'm just going to remove the ones that are related more to home ownership. And so things like refining regulations and processes to removing housing development. That's a set of actions that the city can take. It's already done a lot of things with recent projects. Partnering with nonprofit organizations that build affordable rental units for low-income households. So partially your low income, your market rate affordable housing. So it's not as government subsidized, or your government subsidized affordable housing. Those are certainly both types of housing that are needed. Looking at local funding sources to support housing development for those low and middle income households that I was just talking about. Partnering with organizations that provide services to help people transition from houselessness to being housed. And funding to support construction of needed infrastructure, so things like roads and water and sewer, those kind of things. Those are all really important. So I'm going to hand it back over to Kim, and she's going to introduce what we'll do next.
All right, great. Thank you, Beth. We want to be able to have a conversation with you all about some ideas. In order to do that, we are actually going to need to promote everybody who is in attendance here up to the panel to do so. So we will be doing that momentarily. But first, I just want to note for our conversation, we do have two primary questions that we want to focus on. I do want to be sure that we allow the conversation to happen organically and that we are able to capture everybody's feedback. So we do want to have a couple of ground rules for the discussion. Certainly we want to be sure that we allow everybody who wants to speak and provide input the opportunity to do so. And so be mindful as you provide feedback that we are providing opportunities for everybody to have a chance to have their say. We just want to be sure, there's a lot of different ideas out there, a lot of different opinions. And so just in your comments, please be sure to be considerate of other viewpoints and be respectful in your comments. We want to have a productive conversation, and so, be thoughtful, be kind. And with that, we can do a quick round of introductions. I feel like our crowd here is not that big, so I will ask Mandy to promote whoever is an attendee that has not already been promoted. You will get a box that pops up on your screen asking to be promoted as a panelist, so please be sure to click OK or whatever it asks you to do, and then we will join you here in the group momentarily.
So Kim, shall we go around and start calling on people to introduce themselves?
Yes, we can do that. I will, so that it's not totally disorganized, I will go ahead and sort of direct traffic on that. And so first, I will give the opportunity for Mayor Fitzgerald and then Councilor Berry to introduce yourselves.
Greetings, everybody. Julie Fitzgerald, Mayor of Wilsonville. So glad you're all here.
I guess I should go. So Carolyn Berry, Wilsonville City Council. This is my first term. My background has been urban planning, and this is a subject that I'm really interested in. Thank you.
Great. Next, we will move on to Councilor Linville and then Commissioner Mesbah.
Good evening. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Joanne Linville. I am a member of the Wilsonville City Council and excited to hear this information and be able to share some thoughts hear the thoughts of the group. Thank you.
My turn. This is Kamran Mesbah. I'm on the City of Wilsonville Planning Commission and very interested in housing as a very intractable problem.
Great. Commissioner Willard, and then, my screen, Commissioner Neal.
Jennifer Willard, Planning Commissioner. Happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Catherine Neal, Planning Commission, and I'm also very happy to be here.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think that covers all of the city councilors and planning commissioners. We do have a couple of members of staff here as well. So Miranda and Amanda.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Miranda Batechel. I'm the planning director for the city of Wilsonville. Welcome and thank you all for being here tonight.
And I'm Amanda Guile-Hinman. I'm the city attorney.
And then Beth, you have introduced yourself, but Scott, I would like to allow you an opportunity.
Hi all, my name is Scott Goodman. I work at Echo Northwest, working with Beth and city staff on this project. I'm a person helping with note-taking and putting presentations together. And when Beth says, hey, look this thing up, while I fill some space, I'll go find that thing in the background and pull it up for folks.
Great, thank you. And then we do have a few attendees that are listed that have not been promoted. And so we don't want to force you into the conversation. If you do not want to choose, if you just kind of want to listen, that is absolutely fine. But we do invite you to hop on over here if you so choose.
And Kim, if I could, for anyone watching us on YouTube, there's going to be a slight pause here in a minute for a technical reboot, but we can continue. It should just be momentary, but you'll see it on YouTube briefly.
So Kim, when people have something to say, do you want them to raise their hands, or how would you like to have that work?
I think that would be the cleanest and easiest to corral way to control it. I'll have that you can call on people as you see hands. And I guess I would first open it up before we move into the discussion, just to if there's any questions on the presentation that Beth can answer before we move along. All right.
Well, I had one clarification. I just couldn't find my mute button. I just wanted to clarify that the percentages that you gave on housing, that's by household count, right? Or by unit. You know, you had the 43%, I think it was, single family detached.
Yeah.
That was by unit.
That is number of dwelling units.
Okay.
Percentage of dwelling units as a percentage total.
Okay.
Okay, Beth, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. So I want to emphasize that we're really early in the project. We've done technical research. We understand some of the problems. We don't understand all of the problems enough. But that is, part of what we're seeking to do here is get a more nuanced understanding. What we're going to do here, I hope, is talk about what the barriers are to accessing affordable housing. So in Wilsonville, we framed it that way, so that, it's not just about what are the barriers to building affordable housing or developing affordable housing, or preserving affordable housing, but what are the barriers for, individuals to get into affordable housing. And I would say, obviously, we started before with a little list to acknowledge some of the very, very common barriers. So at the very least, there's not enough housing that is affordable to households for rent in Wilsonville. That's not a unique problem. So let's just acknowledge that right up front, and then go from there and talk about nuances of that or barriers that we don't have on the list. And then the other question is what would you like to see the city do to increase access to affordable housing? So Scott is going to type, your ideas as he hears them onto these little cards. Sometimes things might get a little bit small to see, and if such, we'll just enlarge them a little bit so that we can see them. And what we'll do with this is, in the end, in the thing we call the strategy, you're required to articulate what are the barriers to accessing and building affordable housing in the city. And those need to be directly connected to what is it that the city is proposing to do. So we want to make sure that we're not trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. So with that, and we can jump around from barriers to solutions, however you'd like. Councilor Berry, sorry.
Councilor Berry.
There, now I'm off mute. Okay. So I know that you're talking about access to affordable housing, but what I see is that it's the rent rate increases that go up from year to year and forcing people to relocate. And
so it's the rate of rental increases.
Yeah, so it would be nice, like if it was in Oakland or California where they have rent caps where it can only go up so much. And I think the state has some kind of limit, but it's fairly high. And it'd be nice if the city could do something about it.
Okay. Oh gosh, Nicole, I apologize. I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name.
Oh, you're fine. Yeah, hi, my name is Nicole Hendricks. I serve on Wilsonville Planning Commission, and I also am a board member for the Wilsonville Community Sharing, which is a local nonprofit who does food bank work, and also some work that I think is related to this conversation, which is why I mentioned it. One thing that we've seen a lot more at Wilsonville Community Sharing is still a need, obviously, for food, but also more need for support for paying utilities. Mm-hmm. So I think utilities are a barrier for affordable housing. At least that's what we've kind of been seeing more of. And then the other thing is application fee, like fees to apply to get a space, and then also having to have that like first and last month rent. So that upfront cost of renting is a big barrier. And then the third thing I thought about when you showed the slide of I think it was kind of around like maybe ADA access and things like that. I also thought about just safe housing, like making sure it's healthy, it's a healthy space to live in, whether that's, no mold, or making sure you have the proper like alarm systems and things like that. I think that's something that could be considered. Thanks.
So do you mind if I suggest a few potential solutions to some of these?
Yes, please.
You can tell me what you think. So the cost of utilities, sometimes there are nonprofits that are involved in helping subsidize utilities. So the city could look at, and the city may already do this, and I apologize if I'm hitting on things the city does, may look at partnerships to better support that. And sometimes the city can support its partners that already exist in writing grants to get more funding for that. So that's oftentimes a funding issue.
And I will jump in and say City of Wilsonville does support Wilsonville Community Sharing. So we do appreciate that.
Sure.
So yes, step in the right direction for sure.
But there may be, ways to expand on that partnership.
Yeah.
And then the application fees and the entry costs. I need to look at some of the what cities are allowed to do around renter supports and renter controls, because there may be some things that the city can do around that. I think when you think about the stronger rent increase limits, there's a word for that I'm of course blanking on. That's not something I think the city can do on its own, stronger rent control. But the city can certainly lobby the state to increase its rent control regulations because they're perhaps generous. So. Other ideas? Yes, ma'am. Mayor Fitzgerald.
That's okay, Mom. I think the Fitzpatricks were cousins. But I did want to ask about the rent controls, that concept. I have read that, I know that it is sometimes difficult to find a builder, developer who can, sees building a new complex as profitable. They have to make money to even build it, or they'll go somewhere else because they have to make money. And then if you put rent controls on it, I would, unless there's some other solution that gives them compensation, I've read that could make that builder, most of whom are often out of state, just say, okay, whatever, we're going to a different state. Then we're left with further housing limitations, which doesn't help us because we're still where we were.
There are definitely trade-offs.
So are there ways to get around that?
I think there are some incentives that the city could offer. I don't think the city has the multiple unit property tax exemption, which is for developing multifamily housing that's affordable.
I think we do. Don't we?
So I'll jump in on that one. That is one of the tax strategies that we highlighted in the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan. There's several different tax exemptions and tax abatements. We have not more formally explored that program yet. So that's kind of one of those things that we have identified and, evaluated at a high level, but we haven't really gone into further exploration of that. So that could be something to note for the list of strategies.
And so that particular tax exemption can help with the exact kind of housing that it's really hard to get, the housing that's affordable in sort of the low part of middle income. So like from 57,000, I'm just going to name a number, $57,000 in income for a household of four, up to, I don't know, $75,000 or $80,000, where you're having households that can't afford market rate rents. And can you negotiate through using the multi-unit property tax exemption development of some lower cost, lower rent for a selected period of time, up to 10 years, some lower rent units. And certainly cities have been using this across Oregon. Portland uses it, Eugene uses it, Bend has been implementing it. There's ways to do it that I think reduce the developers who apply for it because it's there and because maybe they can, get some benefit out of it, but could otherwise build housing that's affordable on those income levels and are just choosing not to. So that's one potential approach. Another approach is looking at different types of multifamily development. I've been talking to Hood River some, and they've been talking about an organization out of they're locating at the Port of Portland that's looking at developing modular multifamily housing, which can be rented, can come in at a cost that is well below market. And so is there something that the city can put into the pot? So something that developer would want, and you have some development agreement with them to ensure that housing, stays affordable at that income level for some period of time. And so I think some of those things are some potentials. So more carrots than sticks necessarily. I want to call back on Councilor Berry, however, who's had her hand up.
Unmute. So I like how this conversation is going. I'm really pleased. But when I was talking about rent control, I was thinking more instead of not necessarily for the new housing that's being planned or built eventually, but for the existing renters, because the rents keep going up so much, and we want to keep our population stable in here, right? So that's what I'm thinking.
And so rent control does generally apply to existing, like older housing. So if I'm remembering Oregon's laws correctly, rent control doesn't apply for the first 15 years that a unit is being rented. It applies after that. So it is for your existing households.
Thank you.
Yes, certainly. And just need to look a little bit more into the details of what a city can do with rent control.
I want to jump in and interrupt here. I do see that Council President Ackerball has joined us, so I just want to give her an opportunity to do a quick introduction to the group.
Sure, thank you. And I'm sorry that I couldn't be here earlier, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to listen, and I'll be able to review the earlier discussion later because I understand this has been recorded. So at this point, I think it probably makes most sense for me to just continue observation of the conversation and jump in as needed and appropriate later on. Thank you.
Certainly. So other things that people want to talk about, barriers or things that the city can do. So Commissioner Willard.
Hello. So I had a couple of questions. One is I've done a quick search on vacation rental by owner, and it does not appear we have a lot of short-term rental inventory in the city. Is that true statement? We do not have a lot of short-term inventory?
I will need to look that up really quickly. I believe that is a correct statement.
If that were not true, then maybe limits on short-term rentals could open up some units.
Certainly, and that is certainly something that cities like Newport or Hood River have certainly done, but I don't believe that it is a significant issue for Wilsonville. So.
And I will add, it's been a while since I've looked at the exact language. We do have some limitations on how you can go about renting something in the short term. And I can take a couple minutes here and dive more into that. But essentially, we do have some guidance within our development code that makes a distinction for what you can do without, what can be done and is considered a home occupation. A key thing there being there is the presence of an owner in operating that home occupation, an owner or the person living there, versus having something more as a standalone vacation that I think we see in a lot of places. It's not that our code disallows that, it's that our code considers that to be a home business and then requires a conditional use permit process, which is essentially a hearing before the DRB. So it's there's a much higher barrier to entry in terms of having at least a legally operating standalone vacation home in Wilson.
Well, then one of the things that the city could potentially do is with the Frog Pond development, how we are trying to motivate more ADUs as middle housing and making sure that it's easy to rent those out, not as short term necessarily, but more as longer term rentals. And so there's not a lot of barriers there for that to be offered. The other question I had was, the statistic that you shared about the increase in rent, the increase in home ownership is outpacing the increase in rent. And so I'm trying to think about how that plays out, because is there anything that we could or should do to motivate people to offer to invest in real estate as rentals versus buying it outright? In other communities, it's the opposite, where people are buying houses and being landlords actually exacerbates the problem because there's more inventory, less inventory available for people to purchase as an investment as their own home. And so I don't know if there's anything there that you might be able to put some wisdom on.
So first of all, I want to go back to the issue of short-term rentals. There are some in Wilsonville. It's not a large number of them. So you've got around 50 or so on a base of a lot more dwelling units than that. So you don't have a lot of them. So that may not be a problem. And for a place like Wilsonville, It's not like pardon me for a moment, but it's not like you're at the coast or you're in the gorge where, it's just, or your Bend where it's very obvious that you're going to get a lot of tourism. So
you clearly haven't been out on our river.
I have, but that's a day trip.
Yes, no, you're right. I am just.
I don't want to say that Wilsonville's unattractive because I find it very attractive. But it's, I think, very attractive as a place to live. And so that may well be a solution that is not necessarily in need of a problem that's not in need of a solution.
Sounds like it. I agree.
And so then on your other question, how can you incentivize people to become landlords, I think is the
and if you think that would be helpful.
It could be helpful. So what I'm observing, and this is hearsay, but I've heard, across the state, a lot of concern from mom and pop landlords that they're being essentially put out of the business of being a landlord because the renter protections are really strong. And so, it's harder to evict somebody who's not paying. You've got the issues of rent control and that kind of thing. And so what I think this is leading to, and this is an intuition, this is not data-based, but is more corporate homeownership, which isn't really what I would say, in my opinion, is good for a local housing market. So it's not your neighbors owning the rental housing, it's corporation in place B that's somewhere else that's not in your community.
Yeah.
And so I don't have an answer to that question of what is it the city could do, but that is an interesting question that I think we could noodle on. And I don't know how good an answer that we'll come up with, but it's certainly a question that's worth asking. So I think more research is needed on that. Oh my, Commissioner, I really don't know how to pronounce your last name. I'm sorry, sir.
It's Mesbah.
Give it a try. I respond to any
The problem is these words are written so tiny and I'm getting old.
Related to that question that we were just discussing, some HOAs have added to their CCNRs
you can't rent.
A prohibition to renting. I know in Charbonneau, some of the HOAs have discussed it and some have done so. I don't know, again, how much impact that has on the supply of rental units being available, but that could be a problem as well.
Maybe not so much in Charbonneau, but if you look at something like the Bois or what you're building in Frog Pond, I can see that, being an increasing problem. And so I think that's a question of what tools does a city have to fight back against that kind of thing? And that's a legal question that I think I'd want to talk with Amanda about at some point, perhaps not right now. Well,
it seems to me that it is a discriminatory kind of action. So I guess I'm surprised that we don't have state rules against it.
I'm pretty sure that we don't have state rules against it, and HOAs, they have a lot of power that is just really interesting that people accede to an HOA having that much power. So I see Mayor Fitzgerald with her hand up.
Thank you. I have been wondering if there is, well, I know we have to find money for this, but the idea of city-owned land, and this might be something, and I actually think I heard this from Miranda Bates-Shell as an idea, so I'm not going to make it sound like it's my idea. So before we start growing into our urban reserves, we know that they're out there. We know where they are. could cities then, we've got to find the money to do it, but buy some of that land, then that land could be, or find a way to buy it with a partner, available for a land trust.
Yes.
And put a CC&R or whatever, to put something in the deed where it is like a Habitat for Humanity or Proud Ground, where it says that only people who are at 80% of AMI or below can live here, and so that kind of a thing. So I like the idea of some home ownership opportunities to do that, and then of course also multifamily rental. And if you could do that, it sounds kind of like a Pollyanna idea, but have you seen that done so that, just gives you some housing that is not owned by a giant conglomeration from out of state?
Yes. Looking at land trusts is something that I think it's one of the few solutions to getting into affordable housing for lower and middle income households that are just so very priced out of our housing market. And there's just not enough capacity in land trusts. And I know that that's been talked about some at the state level. And I don't know what solutions are coming out of those discussions. Hopefully we'll be finding that out soon enough. We'll be hearing about that. I hope there are some solutions. If the city had a source of funding, and a source of funding that's big enough, I'll just shoot for the stars here. One of the options is that Wilsonville could have its own bond for housing, affordable housing bond. You've had Metro do one. Last I've heard, Metro is thinking about doing another, but Wilsonville could do an affordable housing bond if it had enough community support for that. You're not going to get enough money to do that out of something like a construction excise tax, because that money has to be used in very specific ways, and it's going to take a long time to accumulate that. But that's not saying that there aren't other ways of acquiring land, and including acquiring land that is within the Metro UGB and within the Wilsonville city limits. So that's already in the UGB. So land trusts are undoubtedly an important one. I'll talk about one of my favorite versions of that. You can use your urban renewal, and you have to be careful with this, but you can use urban renewal for purchasing land. And you can use that land to support development of housing that is income restricted and long-term affordable. Or you can use it to support development of housing that's going to be something like mixed income, where you're mixing some lower incomes, some middle incomes, and some higher incomes. It's always hard to get that financed. So money is a tricky part of that, but land is an important piece of that. So those are some options there. You could probably, in an urban renewal, look at partnering with land trust for affordable home ownership, but there's probably some important considerations with how urban renewal works about not doing too much of that, because that starts to erode your urban renewal tax base. So there's that. And what the city of Hood River, I'm just so impressed with the little city of Hood River, what they've done, is they use their urban renewal to buy a hunk of land that was inside their UGB, that was undeveloped, obviously. And they have partnered with an affordable housing developer to do low income and mixed income development. And now they're looking at another hunk of land right next to it that might well be this modular housing, modular multifamily housing. And so you can use different sorts of development agreements. Or if you're working with a nonprofit that builds income restricted affordable housing, because of federal requirements that there's already going to be restrictions on that housing has to stay affordable at, say, 60% or less of AMI for 60 years, because that's what the federal standards are. So land trusts do that. Income restricted affordable housing developers who are getting federal money and state money, they do that. You don't have to worry about those deed restrictions. And then there's deed restrictions that the city can enforce itself, which is just a lot more administrative work. I know the city of Madras has worked around that to support development of sort of middle income and lower income housing. There's all kinds of interesting ways to do that. And you can also get into, I feel like I'm getting a little too technical here, but you know, you're familiar with system development charges because you all run the city. So you can get into waiving or exempting system development charges by backfilling them with funding from another source. And so City of Madras has used a lot of its urban renewal funds to do that. So it's backfilled the cost of system development charges so that the developer isn't paying them in agreement for either certain types of housing or housing that's affordable at certain income levels for a set period of time. So I get all excited about those sorts of options. Commissioner Willard, I think.
I just asked ChatGPT what it thinks.
What did it tell us?
It has lots of things that we already talked about, but there was one that we did not specifically talk about, which is offer property tax abatements to property owners who commit to keeping their rental units affordable for a certain period. Yeah, we talked about it with the multi-unit property tax, but we didn't talk about it with non-multi-unit, with more townhouses and single-family homes.
And I don't know that we have in the state of Oregon an authorized tax abatement that does that. I certainly haven't seen it used very much. So let me look into that to make sure that I'm not making something up. But I don't think any of our property tax abatements in Oregon that are authorized in Oregon do that. Now, that doesn't mean that that's not a good idea, but it probably has to get through state approval, that kind of thing. Mrs. Mayor.
Sorry, I didn't want to monopolize, but I do have another burning question. In Cornelius, I believe it is, they have their library on the ground floor of a building that is affordable housing. I think it's senior affordable housing. And are you familiar with that one?
No, but I love that idea.
Yeah. And so the mayor said they saved money on that because the roof of the library was the floor of the affordable housing. And so I'm thinking about if you had a bond on the ballot that had some things like, I don't know, some really appealing things that various aspects of your community would like. We don't need a new library, but it could be a theater, gym or something like that, and then have that affordable or mixed use housing above it and somehow mix those funding sources. Have you seen anything? Does that have any legs?
I think it's an interesting idea. I think I'd want to talk with my affordable housing folks for them to tell me where there's the hangups. And then how do you get around the hangups? So, Commissioner Willard. Okay, I'm sorry.
That was left over. Sorry, I'm lowering.
No worries. I love these ideas. So in a lot of ways, the base problem here is oftentimes funding. We do a lot of work also for the state and with the state. And so we're often giving that feedback to OHCS and to DLCD, Department of Land Conservation and Development. And so, and I don't know how much hope I have of the state coming through with certain types of funding or allowing cities to do things that would raise more funds other than things like bonds or construction excise tax. But certainly a construction excise tax, potentially a bond, is something that I'm hoping we'll get an opportunity to talk about through this project. And it may well be that it's just not the right thing for the city. In this project, what'll come out of this project is essentially an action plan for the city to implement over 6 years. And one of the actions might well be, evaluate issuing a bond to do X, Y, and Z. And it may be that action just isn't politically acceptable. And the city would have a chance to change that action to some other action. But if you're willing to have some discussions, I was working in Grants Pass, and I'm like, we should talk about a bond. And I'm like, waiting for them to throw me out the door, basically, because that's not something that community was really able to talk about. But if there's room to talk about something like that, then there's, I think, room to think creatively and look at some of those opportunities. And it may not be the right thing for the city, and you can decide that as we're working on this. It's not like you mentioned it once, so it has to be in there. But I think the idea of being able to talk about that kind of thing is pretty interesting, and maybe we can come up with something that will help. Are there other barriers to accessing housing that you're concerned about? Things that you've been hearing from your neighbors or housing developers, nonprofits that you work with? Councilor Barry.
When we were touring some businesses in Oregon Tech, we talked about, this might not be exactly answering your questions, but it's another idea. So we were talking about affordable housing for like students or teachers coming into the city for more of a short-term opportunities. And maybe there's some way the city can partner with that.
So are you thinking about something like dormitory housing or more than 30 days, so not short-term housing, but, temporary housing that's, for a few months?
Yeah, I was thinking more like, 2 weeks to 2 months. Mm-hmm. The mayor and the other councilors might have other ideas also on that. But for people that come in to take a course, or maybe you have a professor that's coming in to teach a short-term project, and maybe we can find some office space or building space that's already available and vacant that could be converted.
Certainly. And so what I'll say about office space conversion, because this is an interesting area for people to look at. Obviously, it's possible and it can happen, but it's something that's hard to make financially feasible. So many buildings, the retrofits you'd have to do, including new plumbing, that kind of thing. So many buildings, it would just be cheaper to pull down the building and build a new one. I know that some of my colleagues have been doing work on that, looking at bigger buildings in places like Portland and Seattle, so bigger than what we're talking about in Wilsonville, but there may well be some opportunity that we're not aware of. So looking for those kind of opportunities. Short-term housing is it's a little bit of a hard sell in certain ways, because you constantly have people turning over. It might be something that you get more out of things like accessory dwelling units and that kind of thing. So that may be, more of a small scale sort of opportunity. Council President, please.
Thank you. And I hope this comment's not off track or off base, but something that I have pondered on over the last couple years, and I wonder with your expertise, can give some perspective on it or explain if you've seen this happen in other areas in the state or have any ideas on how it might apply here. And that is just speaking from my own personal experience. The first home that I was able to purchase was in another country, which had a different format or model. And in this situation in Sweden, it was kind of like an HOA, because we've talked some about HOA, and I know that HOAs are complicated and multifaceted things, right? Mm-hmm. But the HOA carried some of the loans this was a middle housing kind of situation where there was multiple, like a multiplex or something, multiple units. So the HOA carried some of the loans for that group of housing, which made the entry cost into buying the home much lower and much, much more affordable. However, then our HOA fees went to helping pay the loans that they had taken on. Or, like the servicing for those loans. And the HOA was able to have better financing, and so, the term for their loans was lower. And it just provided an easier entry point into buying a home and kind of having that first-time home ownership experience. And this is like standard operation in Sweden. This wasn't a special situation. Is there anything like that here? Is there any takes on that here? What's your perspective, or what do you see as being potential risks, or how it could or could not roll out in our environment?
So of course HOAs don't play that role here, but that doesn't mean that somebody else doesn't play that. So one of the ways you can think about this is that's almost like a condo association, except the condo association doesn't usually carry part of the loan. And building condos in Oregon is a little bit hard because of financing related to our condo defect laws, which are just discouraging of that. And I know there's been work to make that better. But then you've got a limited equity cooperative. And Scott may have some thoughts on that, because I think he might have attended the session at OAPA that I didn't attend about this. But you essentially have a co-op, so an organization that's building, say, a few buildings of middle housing types, where they're doing part of the financing, and then you buy into it, and the amount that you can sell your unit for later is lower than the overall market rate, but you get some of the increase in value of the unit out of it. That's why it's limited equity. Scott, what am I missing in that description?
That they're super cool and that we really like them. And one of the issues, so it is growing in the state and regionally. One of the issues that they're running into with them right now is that financing, where on the East Coast, they're having a bit more luck with that because there's more precedent. Here on the West Coast, there's not as many examples of them, so banks are a lot more hesitant to give loans. So even to that larger cooperative. So they're having a difficult time just getting the financing in place. That being said, it is something that there's a few players in the Eugene area. There's some really interesting things happening up in Seattle as well that are giving that precedent, so that banks, the time frame is difficult to say when they're going to be more likely to start giving out more traditional loans and terms, but there is a growing appetite for that. And so I find it extremely hopeful and exciting as well.
And so the things that you could do, I was joking with somebody the other day that whatever city I was talking to, I'm like, you should just, have a community bank, just, found a community bank city. And I'm going to leave that at 95% joking, but what an interesting idea that somebody who understands banking more than I do should talk about. So the things that you can do to support a land trust are similar to the things that you could do to support a limited equity co-op. So if you have land, if you can pay system development charges or lower system development charges for that through paying for it. You have to pay the system development charges, you, the city, yourself. So you have to have funding to do that. Another thing I would think about, and I apologize, Kim or Dan, if I'm talking out of school here, but looking at system development charges that are scaled to the size of your unit. I don't know if the city already does that, but I know that Newport, for instance, if you imagine Newport, they've got all this beachfront and people want to put up their big, fancy beach houses. And so, and the people who live and work in Newport are going to have smaller, more modest, physically smaller units that aren't beach accessible. And so Newport has system development charges that are scaled to the size of the unit. So a smaller unit is going to pay less system development charge than a larger unit will pay. And so that's one opportunity, is looking at your system development charges and how you charge them, who you're charging for what, rather than just have, all households pay $1,000 or $10,000 for this system development charge. This small house, 1,000 square foot house pays less than this 3,000 square foot house. I think that some cities are looking at that also, and that can help support development of your starter homes, essentially, those small homes that aren't being built as much.
And I know, Dan, through the Frog Pond work, there was some initial exploration into this topic. So I don't know if there's anything else he would say about that work at this time. I think there were some different ideas that were looked at as part of infrastructure funding and financing and SDCs. So I'll give him an opportunity to maybe add any additional color to that.
Sure, that was on the scope of our Frog Pond work, and it's a work in progress still, and we'll be bringing that conversation to council at some level, and we have been here in the coming months, but it is something that's being looked at and discussed.
All right, so my original idea wasn't so original, but maybe it's an idea that is supportive for Wilsonville.
I think one thing in my mind that it speaks to, I'm seeing a lot of great ideas. I think, not to pat ourselves on the back, but one thing that I can say, having worked on the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan and having been here through a lot of these more recent planning processes, is we've done a lot of things. We haven't done everything. There's a lot of things that might be a good fit or not a great fit for our community, but I think, from my point of view, where I sit, I'm very much appreciative of the thought and the effort that's put into these topics around housing over the past several years. I think it's really exciting to hear all of these ideas coming from you. So, that's why, Beth, it's like, oh, creative idea, but really we've been trying to give a lot of creative thoughts to housing over the past several years. So I think we're well poised to keep doing that with this strategy, for sure. So
what I will observe about the housing production strategy is that a lot of cities have been thinking about these great ideas, but the great ideas fall by the wayside as other problems come up. I'm not saying that Wilsonville does this, but the housing production strategy, it requires the city to have these discussions on a timeline that is at least partially, the city's decision about when to have them. And so it sort of puts it on an official an official work plan. So Councillor Berry?
So you piqued my curiosity when you mentioned like starting a bank within the city, because just last week I was talking with a friend, and when her daughter had gone to a local grade school in the Portland metro area, that grade school started a credit union. And I think eventually that credit union got bought out by one of the bigger credit unions that is still in existence. But I thought that was really interesting.
So, one of the things that cities have historically not dabbled in is how to pay for housing development, large scale. Obviously, how to pay for parts of housing development, like land, to support that affordable housing development. That's it, part of the conversation. So I feel a little crazy speaking out that way, but I don't know. Some of our solutions, I think, to this intractable problem are going to have to be really different than in the past.
Sometimes we just have to think outside the box or pretend there is no box.
Exactly. And I mean, if it was something that Wilsonville wanted to explore as part of its HPS, I think I'd want to know a lot more before I said. I mean, it's not my job to tell you guys no, but it is my job to tell you what some of the risks are. But if this is an interesting topic, it's a topic we can talk to some of our colleagues who know more about affordable housing finance about. And find out if there's some examples of this and look at it more closely. Mayor Fitzgerald.
Thank you. I believe Representative Gamba has, I don't remember how far he went with it, but he has introduced a bill for a bank of the type you're describing. That would be, it does exist in other states, and it would be a new thing for Oregon. So that's one idea. We could maybe make a note to look into that. And I wondered about, and that was last session, so I don't remember where it is right now. I also wondered about philanthropy. And with the land trust, one of the places they get money, and it depends on, where they are and how they're operating, is very significantly capable philanthropists will be motivated. They want to see this housing, so they'll make a multi-million-dollar charitable gift. And I think about that a lot because I do that in my profession. So it would have to be somebody from the community who really wants to see the community have this value. And so to get, I don't know, how would you get that? I just think about how to get the spirit of that going. It might be that we need to have a community foundation or something. Do you have any examples of communities who really excelled in that?
Not that have excelled, but that have tried. So what I'll observe is that nonprofit organizations, they're rooted in the idea of philanthropy and raising funds. Cities are not.
Yeah.
And so, my thought here, my initial thought here is, hey, let me check out what Medford's been able to get going with this, because I know they were talking about this a fair bit. And I don't know where it's gone. But you don't really necessarily want to try to turn your city into a nonprofit in that way, and in terms of hiring staff, unless you mean to, but hiring staff who are doing that fundraising. But that doesn't mean you can't have a community-based organization that that is part of their strength. And part of what the city is doing is working closely in partnership with that organization and figuring out how to remove the barriers to, developing housing. And maybe there's a fundraising foundation, and there's an affordable housing developer, who, are have some partnerships, and then they're working in partnership with the city. And so what is it that the city can do? And there's quite a lot that the city can do about assisting with development ideas and forwarding them. And
maybe it's a Habitat for Humanity chapter, because they are the nonprofit that is that partner to receive those gifts. And they do it to some degree, but I don't know how often in Oregon there are substantial charitable gifts to Habitat for Humanity.
And I of course can't answer that. And what I can observe is that Oregon, we don't have very many Fortune 500s. When you compare us to places with lots of genuinely rich people, we're not that as much. So, in Seattle, you've got more people, like people who founded, Microsoft and so on and so forth. California has more of your Silicon Valley folks. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking about that. I live in Eugene, where, we've got the night arena and the night this and the night that from Phil Knight. So I haven't seen him making any investments in housing. So you have to find the right person. That's maybe an idea to keep in the background a little bit and look for opportunities where it would make sense. And there may well be partnerships where that makes a lot of sense. I think about fruitful partnerships. The only thing I would caution the city with this is its housing production strategy, which is what these are all going into, should be actions that the city is willing to commit to trying a good faith effort to implement over the next 6 years. And I would say has some chance of success. It may well be that there's some recommendations that you really don't want to lose track of that don't make it to actions, but make it sort of onto the list. So there's a little bit of caution. I would recommend, without destroying the good ideas. And the city can choose to be, to put some things on there that just may not work out, and you have to, work with DLCD a little bit later to remove them from the list and put something else on. There's nothing wrong with shooting high, aiming high. So we've got about 7 minutes left. I want to make sure anybody who hasn't spoken, who has ideas that they'd like to put forward or questions they'd like to raise, has that opportunity. Yes, ma'am. Counselor, is it Linville?
Yes, it is. So one of the, I think the city of Wilsonville has one of the highest percentage of rental properties compared to within the metro area. We are the highest. It has been my opinion that because of the rent increases and the economics, that it's been some of the most unstable housing for our citizens. And yet the dilemma is that many of those people cannot afford to get into what I would consider stable housing, which would be home ownership. So my question, especially having all of our planning commissioners here as well as our counselors, where's the best strategy for us in terms of, do we put efforts into building affordable rental housing? Do we put our efforts into building affordable opportunities for affordable ownership? How do we get to the place where what we have is not a default into an unaffordable housing situation?
So I think you're asking questions of your peers here. And before I shut up and let them answer, I will say that you are right. 49% of households in Wilsonville are renter households. and that is considerably above the Portland region's 40%. And there are some cities with considerably fewer renting households. And then I will also observe that our money systems, our financing systems are set up to build income restricted affordable housing. There's more funding for that proportionately. So income restricted affordable housing, and that the cost of building things like low income housing for home ownership for low income households, the amount of subsidy that you need per household is often fairly large. So the number of your money goes less far, essentially, on a per unit basis. So the number of units that you can support for affordable home ownership, given a limited supply of money, is often smaller. I'm not saying you shouldn't do home ownership, look for home ownership opportunities. I'm just saying that they're proportionately more expensive per unit. And there's less money out there for that in general. With that, I will let other people answer your question. And maybe it's a question that we need to take on as we're continuing this, and have in more discussions and bring actual information into. It's a hard one. I know cities struggle with this one.
It is a hard one for me because we are already high percentage of rental properties. And I just wonder, is there a reasonable cap at some point where it may be financially the only alternative, but it isn't good policy for a community?
I don't think I have an answer to that. So what I would say is over the next 20 years, you should, and I'm using a normative should, which I don't very often, you should plan for some more rentals. Should you also plan for some more affordable home ownership units, more than you have proportionately now? And I think the answer to that is certainly yes. But you wouldn't want to, not have more rental housing. I think that would be bad public policy built in the city, because you'll see rents go up higher and higher at that, under that kind of situation. So I think it's an important discussion of how will the city use its limited resources to help support housing accessibility.
One other comment that I want to make, and I think it's probably data that we saw. Kim, probably you or Amanda may have this at your fingertips, or we can talk about it and look at it as we go through this process. But when I looked at the housing, those people who were the primary users of rental housing, they were there was a great percentage of single persons that were in rental housing. And it might be really good to bring up those data again to take a look at who are our renters. Who are the people that are renting? What is the piece of the public that we are serving in our current rental housing market? And and their incomes as well. So
what I would say is, your single person households, you're at about the same percentage as the rest of the region. I would caution about trying to dig too deeply into this data because Wilsonville's a small city. And when you chop up this kind of data into too small a piece, so household size, renter or owner, and then you try to get into income, then you're going to start getting bad data, essentially. But your percent of households that are one person is a little higher than parts of the rest of the region. But not dramatically. And if we assume that proportionately, more households are going to be one-person households who are renters, and that's probably going to be true across the region. And then we know that, single-person households are going to have lower incomes. It's not that hard to come to a conclusion that you have quite a number of single-person renter households. And we could look at it at the state level. I would caution you with the quality of the data for City of Wilsonville. And that's not Wilsonville's fault, of course. It's census data. It's only so good. So are there any other comments? We're a little bit past our time. I want to respect your evening. This is the first of what'll be quite a number of discussions about these topics. And of course, this will be coming in front of the City Council and the Planning Commission, and we'll bring more information about some of these ideas that are ones that we didn't have on our list currently. So
I'd like to comment and appreciate good, difficult questions for me going through this process. That's always, it feels good to have a very real conversation about some very real issues, and knowing that there's people that are taking this very seriously and looking into the numbers and asking difficult questions. So I appreciate that very much.
Kim, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you, both Beth and Scott. And I also would echo Scott's comments. I think, planning staff, our city staff, we appreciate getting to have these conversations with you. We know that these are complex problems. We know that we at the local government are not necessarily in a position to solve all of these problems, but we want to be thoughtful about the way that as we continue our housing planning and look at new, potentially innovative or different approaches than we've considered before, we appreciate that you all are engaged and providing us with these great ideas. I didn't expect, honestly, to see so many interesting sticky notes as a part of this conversation, and I'm really pleased. I think this is going to serve as a great starting point as we move deeper into this project over the course of the next year is when we're going to be doing the bulk of this work. So we hope to have many more good conversations with you all to help take the work that we've done in those prior planning efforts and the equitable housing strategic plan and develop a housing production strategy that's, maybe gives us some things that we know we need to do or can be simple wins, but also challenges us to do something to ensure that we're creating a place where people can live both now and in the future. So with that, I thank you for your attendance at this meeting. I look forward to the future conversations we're going to have, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.